All right, something that happens every 6 years when two dates land on the same calendar day. This year, President's Day, the third Monday in February, falls on the same day as Day of Remembrance, February 19th. Interestingly, both these days are connected here in the 208. First, President's Day. We've talked about this before, the presidential connection to Idaho. Okay, so let's break it down by the numbers. One would be Benjamin Harrison, the first president to visit Idaho while in office. He also made it a state. The number would be 3 would be the number of trees planted by presidents while they were here. The number 4 would be the number of presidents who have visited all 50 states while in office. Since Lyndon Johnson in 1964, every president had visited Idaho at least once while in office. That'd make it 8 straight until President Donald Trump broke that streak. Okay, so back to number 1. It was that first visit in Idaho's first year where Boise's capital city first made a first-person connection to the country's commander-in-chief. And as we learned in today's 208 Redial, a relatively unknown numbered street hasn't been the same since. There are 2 presidents who played a prominent role in Idaho's history. One, Abraham Lincoln, our 16th president, who created the Idaho Territory in 1863. 2, Benjamin Harrison, our 23rd president.
Yes, he signed the Idaho Admission Act on July 3rd, 1890.
And that made Idaho the 43rd state in the Union. Nearly 1 year later,
Spring of 1891, yeah.
President Harrison hit the road. Well, the rails anyway, on a grand tour of the country. A trip like no other president before him.
But he had a presidential train, and they went south and looped all the way up, and they made their way back through Idaho on the way home.
They must have been in a hurry to get home because
He spent a couple of hours here on the morning of May 8th.
Just a couple of hours? Yeah, but enough time for President Harrison to make a speech, to plant an oak tree on the Capitol grounds, and to leave quite an impression on the residents of Boise. So much so that shortly after that short visit, at the behest of Mr. Jeremiah Brumback, the city of Boise decided to rename a rather insignificant numbered street after the one-term president.
At that point, considering the development of the town and of the area, that was really kind of the outskirts.
In fact, on fire insurance maps of the day, it didn't even show up.
The 1893 map stopped at 16th Street.
But that is how 17th Street became Harrison Boulevard.
It wasn't until 1903 that we finally see the space and the location west of 16th Street show up on the map, and at that point it is designated as Harrison Boulevard.
It was supposed to be Boise's first planned community. They even planned the prices.
Houses had to cost between $2,500 and $5,000 if they were to be built on Harrison Boulevard.
Safe to say, it costs a bit more to live on Harrison Boulevard these days. It wasn't until 1910, when the median was added and the trees were planted, that Harrison became a true boulevard and a showpiece for Boise's North End.
In 1980, that was the year that they designated the entire street as a listing on the National Register of Historic Places. At that point, they really recognized it for its beauty and for the importance that it held within the community. And then 9 years later, in 1989, the city designated it as a historic district.
It all started with a president from the Midwest who had a soft spot affection for those of us out west.
It's important for residents of Idaho to remember that there were certain moments in history where Idaho played a part kind of in the national story.
Harrison's Capitol tree, by the way, was removed during the State House renovation back in 2010. It's not just Harrison. It's not just streets either. About 24 schools have names like Jefferson, Monroe, Washington, Reagan. 5 of Idaho's 44 counties share a name with former leaders of the free world: Adams, Jefferson, Lincoln, Madison, and Washington again. But let's take it back to the streets. Other presidents have left an impression in the city of trees, some without even stepping foot in the gem state. Okay, so in addition to Harrison in Boise's North End, there's Washington Street, and there could have been a haze if it weren't for a missing E. Near the North End, there's Jefferson Street and Madison Avenue on the west side. But it's on the bench where we see the highest number of hails to the chiefs, like Harding Street. Possibly a shout out to President Warren G., who visited Idaho in June 1923 to learn about irrigation on his Voyage of Understanding trip. However, Harding would not survive said voyage, dying suddenly that August, so perhaps it's fitting his street is now a dead end. The bench is also where you'll find Wilson and Jackson streets, and where Hoover intersects with Roosevelt. That's one street with connections to 2 presidents from the same family. Teddy stopped by in 1903 and planted a tree on state capitol grounds. And Franklin, well, he gave a speech at the same capitol in 1937. All right, speaking of Roosevelt, this is intersection of President's Day and Day of Remembrance and its connection to the 208. So let's do that. On February 19th, 1942, President Franklin Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066. And this gave the U.S. Army the authority to remove Japanese American civilians from military zones along the West Coast, while many of them were sent off to fight in World War II. Well, this wasn't the first time the federal government forcibly removed a collection of people from their homeland. And the practice of persecuting marginalized groups, well, that lives on today in some fashion. A couple of years ago, we met with a documentary filmmaker who wanted to remind people anti-Asian sentiment in the United States began well before December 7th, 1941. The bombing of Pearl Harbor pushed public sentiment toward Japanese Americans to a level never seen before. 10 weeks later, on February 19th, 1942, President Franklin Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066. Authorizing the military to round up Japanese Americans and remove them from their homes along the West Coast. About 120,000 were sent to 10 different internment camps scattered from Arkansas to California. More than 9,000 were incarcerated in Idaho at the Minidoka Relocation Center.
The justification for the incarceration orders was that Japanese Americans were committing acts of espionage. The truth of the matter is that the military, through the help of the Federal Communications Commission, realized pretty quickly that none of that was true.
That truth, or the hiding of it, is the basis of a documentary by John Osaki, whose own parents were sent to an internment camp in Northern California. His father lived in San Francisco, a high schooler with a dog.
There was so much hatred directed towards Japanese following the bombing of Pearl Harbor that people considered his dog a Jap dog.
So when he was loaded onto a truck,
he literally had to sit there and watch his dog chase that truck for over a mile until it got too tired and it sat down in the middle of the road and he never saw it again.
Learning about
Alternative Facts tells the story of the false narrative that led to this American tragedy.
We had the intelligence, we had the information, we knew that Japanese Americans were not a threat to national security, but decided to incarcerate them anyways.
The documentary highlights not just the ethnic,
but then you see the Japanese get there and they start creating really productive farms.
but the economic reasons behind the executive order.
And there is a lot of fear that Japanese Americans are going to take over the Central Valley.
They seize this as an opportunity to essentially take over their land.
Does it shock you how easily and how successful it went over?
It doesn't shock me. I think what we've tried to do with this film is just draw a straight line to how that playbook is still very successful today.
Donald Trump defending himself tonight, even comparing himself to FDR.
And it's something that I think we have to be vigilant about, and that real people suffer severe consequences when they get pulled into this political agenda for really power, right? It's really about people acquiring power in this country and using marginalized communities to do that.
If you create fear and demonize an entire group, we saw what that led to. And we're starting to head in a very similar direction.
That's really the lesson of the incarceration of Japanese Americans in World War II. And I think we just have to constantly talk about that, and that a lot of our history in this country is not pretty. And I think we have to be willing to confront that, or we're not going to make progress in addressing this, this dynamic.
We did that story a couple years ago before I learned to properly call it an incarceration camp, not an internment or relocation camp. That award-winning documentary was shown in Idaho for the first time in 2022, 80 years after the signing of 9066. Since then, it has spawned a full open-source curriculum on PBS. And next week, the film's going to be shown in what is, well, it's still known, but what used to be known as the Presidio in San Francisco. It was from there General John DeWitt put Executive Order 9066 into practice, sending thousands of Japanese Americans to be incarcerated at the Minidoka camp north of Twin Falls.